Yep. Okay. Matt, you're beginning to you begin to overcome the complications of Zoom. It's very impressive, I have to say. And the backdrop behind you is the Gromwich strike, and I was there throughout the Gromwich strike, as Pete Fairman and others and Graham and others were at the time. I was there from the NUM delegations that took place there, and there was, if people remember it, the history of it is quite startling, really, which is a group of Asian women just said, we're not taking it anymore, we're not being exploited, and as a result of an act of courage came out on strike. And to give the trade union movement its due at that point in time, there was a huge act of solidarity across London. Mick Brooks is here and he'll know, and Mick, I hope you'll get back to your full health as soon as possible. But Mick and others will know that in West London we organised regular delegations onto the picket lines, and it was pretty brutal. Some people may remember a comrade called Peter Fagan from Hayes, and there's pictures of him with blood splattered all over his face where the police were knocking him about. It was a pretty brutal dispute, but it demonstrated the overall solidarity of our movement. And on that basis, I think we learned a lot of lessons. Let me just talk very briefly. I won't take 9 minutes. I'll just do a couple of minutes, really. I've got a really bad internet connection, so it might well go down, Matt, so I apologise for that. Someone I can't think who thought of the great idea of full fibre broadband right the way across the country, free at the point of need. I wonder what happened to that. Anyway, just to follow on from what Matt was saying, it's been a fairly startling last 10 months with the loss of the election, obviously, but also the pandemic hitting us. And it's interesting, when the pandemic first hit us, it did, I think, shape a rethink of people's views and about their values as well, about what they do value. I think a crisis like that always does. And what came out of that, I think, was an optimism that there's still the potential for quite radical change of how we organise our society, our economy, and also our politics. And since then, I think that's filtered through. I think a lot of people recognise, in terms of their values, actually we do need one another, and they recognise in their values as well that we can support one another. And many people came together in terms of mutual aid, and it wasn't just about clapping the NHS, that was important, but it was also supporting each other in our communities, whether it was via the food banks or through the individual contacts that was made. And there was an element of social solidarity that spread well beyond our own movement right into the community itself. And from that, I think it has forced a rethink of where we go from here. And it's interesting what's come out of that. Yeah, I think there's been a flood of ideas, one of which, of course, is that we're not willing to tolerate austerity. And it's interesting, even when the Tories have been raising the potential return to austerity, they've been confronted even within their own party with that. The second, I think, also the commitment that there needs to be about investment and long-term investment in the future, particularly in our public services, NHS and social care. We're launching shortly with the social health system, we own it, and keep the NHS public a plan for social care, but also across our public services. And the third lesson, I suppose, was the importance of the state and the recognition that you needed the state, despite all the arguments over the last 40 years from the right about reducing the size of the state. There was a recognition actually you need the key role of the state, a democratic state, in tackling crises like these and laying the foundations of a decent society. And I think that has opened up, despite the loss of the election, despite the setbacks that we've had, it has opened up the potential now for the maintenance of the radical program that we developed in 2017, 2019, but actually going further than that in many instances. But also what it's also thrown up is not just new thinking, but also, I think, the construction of a much wider social movement on issue by issue. And I thought what was very impressive over the last few weeks in particular was the mobilisation of renters through the Renters Union and through ACORN, the way in which they've been able to push back the threat of evictions. Not gone yet, but they've pushed it back, and they'll push it back further by the end of September as well. But also it hasn't, not just pushing back the threats, the whole debate now that has opened up about the whole concept of landlordism and why we should tolerate landlordism at all. The other aspect as well is interesting in terms of the social movement development. It's moved on from just clapping NHS workers into real action now, where you've got campaigns of solidarity in support of NHS workers, days of action across the country, more coming up over the next couple of weeks. But it isn't just about wages and jobs, it's about privatisation too. And it is about the democratic organisation of social care in particular. So you'll see the proposals that have come forward from the Women's Budget Group, and you'll see the proposals from the SHA and from We Own It and Keep the NHS Public for a proper national social care service that is democratically controlled, but also that isn't on the basis of private provision. So alongside every one of these campaigns is a real thought through radical plan for the future. And of course, you can't but mention the magnificent mobilization with regard to Black Lives Matter movement and the way it's constructing, yes, intolerance to racial inequality and racial injustice and racial abuse. But I think more importantly, it's done much more than that. And I'll just give one example. I was on a panel talking about the economy a week ago. And it was interesting that someone intervened and says, we can't talk about the economy anymore in the way that we did, unless we do refer it back to how the riches that are amassed in the City of London, in particular in the finance sector, how finance capital developed this major impetus for the development, I suppose, abrogation of wealth on the basis of slavery and colonialism. And I think it adds a whole new perspective to the way in which we develop economic policy in the future. It isn't just about reparations. Of course, we've got to advance the policy of reparations, but it is about democratic control of our global economy overall. So I just think, despite the setback in the general election, and I agree we've got to learn lessons from what went on the last 5 years, warts and all, and we'll learn those lessons. But actually, we've also got to be inspired by what's happening at the moment. A radical agenda being formed as a result of individual struggles that are taking place on a massive range of fronts, often not reported by the overall media, the mainstream media, but they're taking place. And I think they are radicalizing people, but they're doing it on the basis of really thought through alternatives in those individual areas of struggle. The key for us, and that's what the LRC was founded for originally, was to bring socialists together within the Labour Party and the trade union movement, broaden that into a wider social movement, but at the same time bring those individual struggles together, so in action of solidarity, but also by development of an overall comprehensive programme for radical change of our society. Almost like steam from a kettle at the moment, that's emerging. As I say, whether it's renters campaigning against eviction and then against landlordism itself, NHS developing policies and campaigning not just for decent pay, but for proper democratic NHS, but also social care as well, and all those other aspects that are taking place. I just say is finally, I think the role of the LRC now, and I'm pleased and I'm to be invited to remain as president. I'm proud of that. I think the role of the LRC now is to do what it originally intended to do when we founded it back in the days with Tony Benn and Jeremy and others, which is to be at the forefront of all those individual struggles. That's first, acts of solidarity in that sense. So the social movements that are taking place now, whether Extinction Rebellion or individual trade union disputes or the renters or others campaigning against racial injustice, the Black Lives Movement, we've got to be there at the forefront of that in terms of solidarity, not necessarily, not leading, but supporting. But secondly, I think we've also got to be, we've got to be a hive of activity in terms of intellectual activity, the development of ideas and the promotion of those ideas. And then finally, the third role, obviously, is to win the struggles within the Labour Party itself. I think it's still all to play for. Yes, we've lost the leadership, but actually we've got to create a climate of opinion, both in terms of struggle and in terms of development of policy. And no Labour leader can turn up the 2017-2019 manifestos, but no Labour leader can ignore the necessity of more radical policy making for the future. And I think that's our role, and I think we're well placed. The numbers at this conference today demonstrate that we've still got a basis of support amongst activists who I believe could play an essential role in this coming period. Not opposition for opposition's sake within the Labour Party, but actually the development of a political programme based upon solidarity in struggle. that's it. I just want to make one final mention, if I can, Matt, and I'll shut up. One of my friends died this week, David Graeber. Many of you will have known him. David was an anarchist, effectively, but he was one of the most inspiring people I've met. But he wasn't just a good writer and a good researcher, an anthropologist, etc. But actually, he was a good campaigner as well, involved in Occupy, but also in every other picket demonstration that I've been involved in recent years. David was always there, and I think he's a terrible, tragic loss. I just pay tribute to David once again here. Thanks, Matt.